have just seen an exercise in virtuosity. This is his fourth introduction, and it's a hard act to follow. The reason that was called The Possibilities of Human Existence, it actually was a book that came out in much shortened form, which was called Learning to Be Human, which was the third title. I wanted to call it The Possibilities of Human Existence. One publisher wanted to call it The Human Ground, which I liked, and then they decided that commercially it would do better with Learning to Be Human. But what I had in mind was very ambitious, and it was much larger than what was published. You see, we know a lot about the possibilities of physical and neurological difficulties, not as many as we will soon. Can you all hear me? Not as many as we all will soon. But we have in medicine assembled the possibilities of physical deformity, danger, trauma, or whatever. And the same thing is true to some extent within psychoanalysis, where the possibilities of unconscious different mechanisms, different failures of mechanisms is very much a part of the analytic student's repertoire. But we do not have a grip on the possibilities of human existence. For example, someone comes to you age 25 in a psychosis. If we understood and taught better what is most likely to have been going on in that person's life, then we would be way ahead in terms of reaching them and being effective. But we still haven't laid out the kinds of most immediate familiar dangers that each time and place and relationship confronts. And that's what I was trying to start to do. Come in, Jana. Now, what I want to do today is not that, although it verges on that at certain moments. What I want to do today is to talk about health and sickness as we encounter it. And this is a subject dear to my heart because one of the still largest failings of our work is any kind of attention to health. As many of you know, you can look through countless charts and never hear a good word, a healthy word about the patient. And that must be wrong. That must be fundamentally wrong. Furthermore, I think that's one of the reasons that there's so much stigma about us, because all we do is tell people they're crazy. That can't be right. Well, so I want to do three things today. One, I want to talk about this problem of health and sickness from the viewpoint of the principal schools. Then I want to take up the problem of health and sickness in more familiar situations: sex, love, and principally marriage. What is health and sickness under those conditions? And finally, I want to finish by discussing very briefly my own ideas about how we put health and sickness in perspective in the treatment relationship. What is healthy in a treatment relationship? This is deeply fought over. And if you make a mistake in this area, you can go to jail. That's how hard it's fought over. But let me start first with a summary of the major positions that are taken on health and sickness in psychiatry and psychoanalysis as they're taught today. The most familiar one, of course, is the one that today dominates. That is the disease school, the descriptive, often psychopharmacological approach to the patient. Here we have a great many possible conditions to be identified, and in successive DSM-3s and 4s, you see this rising. It's now over 300. Sickness in that system is one or other of these conditions. But what is health? Health is largely the absence of one of those conditions. Now go to the other extreme in the great schools that dominate our thinking. And remember what Dr. Nasir Ghammi was telling us so eloquently about the fact that we are still in a dogmatic era or a eclectic era. We haven't found ways to integrate the extraordinary things we've learned how to do. Now, the opposite of the disease school is the existential school. And the existential effort has largely been to define health. And in fact, if you look at the clinical reports of these two schools, they couldn't be more different. And that's also true of the contrast between existential work and psychoanalysis. Read sometime Binswanger's correspondence with Freud, and then look at their case descriptions, which is part of what they're fighting about. And Binswanger's patients are awash in good faith and possibility, and as far from abandonable as you can imagine anyone. Well, of course, the Freudian case is typically ensnared in a whole set of very interesting and often very telling and convincing, unconscious and preconscious defenses, idealizations, all kinds of things. So that the existentialists give us a remarkable account of some of the ingredients of human health. They don't do much of a job in trying to identify what human sickness is, and struggle with some of their writings on this. Some of them are extraordinarily tortuous in the ways they are trying to find some ground for complaint about the patient. Now, psychoanalysis is a more complex story, but you know what that story says. You're familiar with it now, very familiar with it. You don't even have to read a book about it because, as I said previously, it's part of our culture, part of the public mind. And in psychoanalysis, we have a developmental psychology. We have a developmental psychology, an inspired one, which has not always been accurate, but has done something even more important. It has stimulated all kinds of further developmental studies, more accurate, more empirical, and more successful. But don't forget it, that came out of the challenge of psychoanalysis to a very large extent. And what is sickness? Sickness is principally some kind of failure in development. That's the idea of sickness that dominates psychoanalysis. Either the two famous words are either regression to an earlier phase or fixation at an early phase. These are what is meant mostly in psychoanalysis by disease or sickness. See how far that is away from either of these other 2 points of view. Now, if you look at relational work, and that has many forms, of course. If you look at relational work, what is sickness in a relationship? Now, that's a subject we could go into at great length, and it's so interesting. But I think part of it, at least, is a big chunk of it is whatever goes wrong between us, whatever doesn't work, whatever gets us in trouble, whatever creates misunderstanding, that in the intersubjective space, as they call it nowadays, in the interhuman, as others have called it, things go wrong. You do not get me. You do not understand me. Or you think you understand me too well, or whatever. 100 things happen. And we'll come back to some of those a little later. But in that space between us, the possibilities of misunderstanding are mostly what we mean by pathology. And what is health? What is health? What is a good relationship? Now, here's a place where the relational people leave us, for the most part, cold, because they're a little afraid to tell us what a good relationship is. Oh, there are notions. Of course there are notions. There are words like authenticity and togetherness and frankness and various things of that kind, but they remain at a general level. Now let me, could I ask somebody to get me a glass of water? Thanks. Let me try to bring this into more specific focus by talking about the way anxiety, the concept of anxiety, the experience of anxiety is handled by these different schools, because that makes the contrast among them very dramatic. Remember now, my point is to show where we are and what we have to get to have a pluralistic psychiatry. And when we see the differences in the attitudes toward anxiety, you see how far apart we fundamentally are. Now, anxiety in the descriptive school is a disease or an illness, or there are all kinds of words they use about this, but it's the problem, anxiety. There are forms of anxiety, generalized anxiety, specific anxiety. There are relationships to other things like anxiety, like panic states, right? Phobias. Thank you, sir. These are diseases, or some word like diseases, these different conditions. Now look at what the existentialists tell us about anxiety. And this is a little hard going, so be patient with me. The existentialists claim that there is such a thing as existential angst, i.e., we are born into a dangerous world. The only thing we can be certain of is death. We live with each other as best we can, and so some level of angst shows we're alive, shows we're awake, shows we aren't kidding ourselves completely, at least. Now here, angst, anxiety in the existential sense, becomes a principal sign of health. Couldn't be more distant from the point of view of the descriptive school. And what do you do? What do you do then if anxiety is a sign of health? What do you do with conditions like panic disorder or phobias? And here the boldness of this point of view comes forward dramatically. What are you supposed to do with a person that has a phobia? What you're supposed to do with a phobic patient is spread that concentration of anxiety through their whole life. The claim being that the reason it's concentrated in the phobic object is that they have simply brought it all into that point. And if you know them well, and here's a challenge that research has not convinced me of, but sometimes I've seen dramatic insight. If you know the phobic patient well, you'll know that in most areas of their life, they're too complacent. They have indeed concentrated their anxiety on the phobic object. In the little Hans case, the famous horse phobia, you can see some of that suggested as well. So here's a view of anxiety which stands diametrically almost opposed to the one most in prevalence today. Now, what do the analysts think about anxiety? Well, there have been a great many speculations about this, but there have been two major notions about anxiety from the analytic school. The first was the earliest one of Freud's, which was that anxiety was a sign of sexual pressure against inhibition. That you are anxious because you wanted to do something, particularly something libidinal, and yet were in part forbidden from it. And that's a view he never abandoned, and a very interesting view indeed. The other idea came later, and it's been the more dominant one, and that was that anxiety is a signal of danger, a signal of danger. An ego state which indicates pressure between superego and id, for example. Now, see how different that is from either the existential view or the descriptive view. What do the relational people think anxiety is due to? What is anxiety in the duo, in the interhuman? What does that mean, right? And this is a subject that those of you who are interested in the developments of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis can explore at greater length than I'll take you through now. But it's very interesting because what they're claiming, most of them, not all of them, but some of them, the ones that at least impress me, what they're claiming is that when we get together and get anxious with each other, what's happening is that some kind of dissociative state, some unacknowledged part of ourselves is being challenged or even attacked by the other person, perhaps unknowingly. So that when you have a kind of serenity between people, It's because they have sort of come to terms with each other, been open in their feeling. And in a little while, I'm going to talk about marriage. And those of you who are married or in close, I don't mean by marriage necessarily the usual kind of marriage, but close and prolonged relationships, those who are in that know that the state of anxiety, and other things too, including rage or whatever, are very often signals of places in which what? We bump up against each other. And what do we bump up against? We bump up against, the relational people say, against dissociated aspects. They don't like to talk about repression, although they could. They like to talk about some part of your mental life which you haven't quite absorbed or taken into account or been comfortable with. And and that literature, of course, is very dominated by the trauma literature, which establishes dissociative parts of the self. Well, so here we have these strikingly conflicting views of anxiety coming from the different schools. Here we have them, and we're expected to frame our clinical work in such a way that, you know, that whatever one we favor doesn't altogether exclude the others. Because in fact, most of us, however closely wedded to one school or another, recognize some of the strengths of those differing points of view. Now let's go on to the subject of sex and love and marriage. Now, the place of sex in psychiatry has been to say it's been a prominent one is to underrate things, because even before Freud made discussions of sexuality permissible, even before that, the professional psychiatric community of the 19th century was obsessed with sex. And what were they obsessed with about sex? They were obsessed with the fetish. The fetish. That was regarded as a pathological phenomena, and because the range of human fetishes is so exotic, is wondrously varied, and the things that you discover people can be drawn to, hypnotized by, are infinite and extraordinary. You know, from the smallest scale of a crocodile. I won't start with that. If you really want to have a sense of the varieties, not of religious experience, but of human existence and of human experience, pick up a book, The Psychopathica Sexualis by Krafft-Ebing, and you won't have trouble finding it. You won't have trouble finding it. This is a book that was published, I think, in the I should know and I've forgotten. 1880. Is Paul Rosen here? I bet he knows. What is it, Paul? It's in 1870s, 1860s. And there are in the present Harvard Library at least 20 copies of this book, and they're still read. Now, you show me any other book in our field that can approach that. When I was considerably younger and I was in school, I gained part of what little prestige I had at that time in my life from translating parts of the Psychopathica Sexualis from Latin, which they were disguised in, into English. And I can assure you that those recitations were interesting. Because the great Krafft-Ebing, who went on, by the way, to be the person who convinced the community that tertiary syphilis was caused by an infection, because he was a scientist as well as a speculator about fetishes, and a compiler of this extraordinary encyclopedia of human interests. Well, now, what did Krafft-Ebing think a fetish was? First of all, he had a view, which Freud put an end to, that sex doesn't begin till puberty. That was the prevailing view in the scientific community, so far as I can tell. Further, fetishes, which would appear very early in life before puberty, and were sexually central very often to the person's whole mental life, they had to have some explanation. Could you guess for a moment what Krafft-Ebing's, and it prevailed as the view that was taught. Can you guess what he thought it was caused by? This says a lot about the human community, I think. He thought it was due to masturbation. this very serious, highly intelligent man, whom Freud came out of, in a sense, and everyone revered, thought it was caused by childhood and other masturbation. And masturbation, in other words, sexuality before adolescence, was regarded as not just sinful, here we go again in psychiatry, but evil and destructive, sinister, pathogenic. Isn't it astonishing? Isn't it astonishing the things we can believe? Of all the forms of sexuality in the world, masturbation is the safest, the only one that doesn't destroy people, the only one that doesn't transmit disease. I mean, it should be a place, it should be something where people could celebrate, you know? I remember trying to celebrate it once on one of our wards, where when I suggested to the staff that, in a quiet way, which I thought I could get away with, that I wondered if there was a place for the patient's private pleasures, I said. I thought that was wonderfully discreet, but it wasn't discreet. If I had set off a bomb in that room, it couldn't have been more horrifying. I got out of there as fast as I could. To think that in a medical community such a thing would be permitted, or certainly not encouraged, was utterly forbidden. But this was Krafft-Ebing's view. Now, you know what happened to this. Freud came along, and first of all, he managed to convince most of the community that sex didn't start in puberty, could begin earlier, maybe even was in some sense present from the earliest parts of life. He didn't think that the fetishes were a product of masturbation. He thought instead, and he had a number of theories, as you know, and many of them he clung to, I think, far too long. But the one that probably he contributed the most to, that has endured as a possibility, was the idea that fetishes are displacements. They are displacements. That is, they are the movement of energy away from the preferred object to something maybe associated with the preferred object or whatever. Now, this is a... Want to come forward? This is a very interesting and difficult... How you know him? You know, fella. Now, exactly what happens here, how we exactly conceptualize this process of displacement is disputed. For example, the instinct people, the people that cling to the instinct theories, think that maybe that the displacement is caused by more instinct pressure than can be managed. While the people who think the relationship maybe to the caregivers or other may affect the displacement, think that something has gone wrong. For example, that instead of the child getting a certain amount of honest, loving nurturance, that's kept from them, and maybe some part of clothing or something, maybe the clothing that the mother wore or the father wore or something, becomes the site of excitement. And you can see already how that kind of idea is easily elaborated. But here we had an extraordinary advance, I think, in our understanding about fetishism. But are they sick? Well, if you don't think they're sick, go read Psychopathia Sexualis. I mean, really, there are things that you really wouldn't expect people, even anybody, to, even people of the wrong class, which was very evident in the descriptions of the German schools about these things. Wouldn't expect them to have, you know. But are they normal or not? Now, when you get to know a lot of patients, which many of you do, you begin to see that most people have preferences. Preferences, objects of excitement, different from one another. Now, in my innocent years, I found myself in the Army during World War II, an enlisted man, and it was a wonderful experience. But at night, things happened that were troubling to me. Nothing bad happened to me, but I listened to people talking in the barracks, the great barracks with 60 men, you know. And by the time I got into the Army, I had to memorize the eye chart to get in. So by that time, we weren't at the bottom of the manpower barrel. We were outside. So maybe that gives me a skewed population. But there were two things that people talked about in the barrel when they had a debate, when they all want to get into the act. The first was incest. I was astonished to learn that incest was very common. And it was more common between step-parents and kids than fathers and mothers and kids, but it was very common. And people would, even when they got talking freely in the barracks at night, boast about some of their conquests within the family. Well, that was shocking. At first I thought they were just trying to scare this weird little kid from Brooklyn, but I realized that they were not paying that much attention to me at all. But there was another great subject to discuss. And I wonder if you could guess what it was in those nighttime, endless barrack discussions. The debate issue that probably aroused the most enthusiasm, except perhaps the Army-Navy game or something like that.
Breast versus buttocks.
Norman, right. It was breast versus leg. But I think you could, I think it's a it's a perfectly good, but the great question in those debates was, are you a breast man or a leg man? And this, as I say, people lined up on one side or the other, the way they would for the Harvard-Yale game or something of that kind. And that surprised me too. But now what was that? That was an effort to get at what a proper fetish was. What an acceptable, decent fetish was. And the leg people thought the breast people were sort of soft in the head, and the breast people thought the leg people didn't understand what they were talking about. So there was very much a pathological division in that thing. So now thinking back on it, I wonder what is a pathological fetish? And, but I'm sure I don't mean to cleanse everything of that pathological onus, but it is a problem, and that's the one I want you to hold in mind for a moment. Now, there's another thing about sexuality that has come forward in the present era, the post-Freudian era too. And I think the person who's most responsible for bringing it to our attention is Robert Stoller, California analyst, a remarkable man, who made his clinical life work concentrated on perversions, as they're sometimes called. Now, he made many interesting remarks, but to me the one that's most interesting to our topic today about health and sickness is he claimed that male sexuality is fueled by hostility. Now that you can hear glimmers of this in the feminist movement, but he came forward with it as a man and claimed that was what human sexuality from the male was dominated by. That was his claim. Now, those of you who have spent some Sunday evenings watching The Sopranos won't be surprised to hear that, will you? Because the F word, which is certainly the most used word in that great series, is all about sort of hostile sexuality. And so if Stoller had lived to see his concepts tested, he might have found in that Sopranos series a confirmation of a certain kind of sexuality which may even dominate. Now, is that sick or is that healthy? The evolutionists would tell us it might be healthy, that kind of hostility, that fighting spirit is necessary to get your woman, spread your seed, make sure you rather than anybody else dominates the next 2 or 3 centuries of human life. They might tell us that. I'm not a fan of evolutionary theory of that kind, but it certainly is a tempting way to look at things. Now let's talk for a little while about marriage. Now, and I don't mean to talk about, I want to talk about long-term relationships of any kind. And I want to suggest, first of all, that it seems to me they often have phases. And I feel like I know something about this, and I'm sure I don't know half as much as I need to know to talk about it, but I think I know something about this because I make my living off of marriage. Without it, I'm sure you wouldn't have such nice I wouldn't have such nice shoes on my feet or clothes on my back. And the phases of marriage contain problems. Now, in our culture, marriage often begins with being in love. I don't think that's questionable. In other cultures where marriages are arranged, that's much less likely to take place. And in our culture, we go from being in love to often to love, a very hazardous transition. Because what causes in-loveness to die out? Why doesn't it go on forever? Well, you find out other things about the person, and you may not like them. They may puncture this idyllic picture of each other that we have for a while. And then maybe you can find your way to something like love. And then sometimes people don't find that way, or they find it later. It's something we might call companionship, friendship as the basis of marriage. And then sometimes people reach another phase, in my experience, and that's a kind of adventurous phase in which they see marriage as an opportunity to, how should you put it, get to know each other. I mean, really get to know each other, right? Now, let's say a word first about being in love. Here's another place where there is an intense argument as to whether it is normal or pathological. It's very easy to say that being in love is a psychotic state. The evidences of it are substantial. First of all, the person overestimates the beloved, often underestimates themselves, degrades themselves. Further, they're intensely jealous, often, and paranoid about intrusions. And fourth, they are often, bereft they're lost, they're depressed if the beloved is not right there. Now, there are paranoid elements in this. There are megalomaniac elements. There are depressive elements. It has enough to entertain a taxonomist for a long, long time. And maybe it is a psychosis. Nevertheless, it's a psychosis of great popularity, a psychosis that people die for, literally and figuratively. Now, there are people who go through life and get marriage, many marriages, because that's their idea of a proper human relationship, being in love. Now, the only reason that many of us don't do that is that we can't afford it. It's an extremely expensive proposition. But if you give people almost untold amounts of money, and you allow them what they want to do with it, you will find that many of them organize their marital life around the principle of being in love. Now, I think one of the crucial things about this account of marriage is to realize that it is a series of confrontations. It is a series of confrontations, marriages. And you know why marriage or close relationship are a series of confrontations. I mean, it's not a discovery of mine, is it? Because what happens when you get up in the morning? You discover that your beloved has burnt the toast, right? Or doesn't have any toast to burn. These are the ordinary phenomena of everyday life. And at first we are forgiving, and we go on about our business, but as they accumulate, My wife, for example, never puts the top back on toothpaste. And I am an obsessive compulsive, and so I want the top back on toothpaste. God damn it. And so there's a right away, there's a cleavage, there's an opening of disparity. There's even an opportunity for contempt. How could you forget the top on your toothpaste? I mean, it's all perfectly absurd. But there it goes, and especially if you're annoyed about something else, or if you're ashamed of something you've done yourself, these things become monumental. These are the successive discoveries that challenge our abiding affections. I have made it my business, and I don't see that Henry is here today, because he studied this too, but it's been my business to try to find out what very experienced people in our work think successful marriage is like. I thought that was very important, because as I try to collect my knowledge of the possibilities of human existence, I want to know what's possible and what it looks like. And one person whose judgment I have a lot of confidence is a man that some of you may know, a Texan named Jerry Lewis. He's a wise old fellow. He's been around forever, and he studied this. And he'll tell you the following. If you, at least he told me the following, and I'm sure he wasn't lying to me. When I asked him, how do you know, what's the characteristic of what you would call the most successful marriages? You want to guess for me? What he'd say? Now, these are people that he's known a long time, who've been together for long periods, who, not sublimely happy perhaps, but that it's a generative and useful and wonderful relationship. Friendship. Who said that? Right. Friendship. That's the first. Or companionship. Right? That's one. What about sexuality? Where does he put that? Low. What? Low. Low. Who said that? Low. Right. He said it was of secondary or more often tertiary importance. Now, I think he's left out something, and I tease him about this a little bit, and he thinks he may, but he may have. And what I say is, what I think he's left out is this other kind of marriage, which is not companionable or friendship primarily, but this exploration, this voyage of discovery. That, I think, is the feature I would add to his list of the most successful combinations between people. That they are interested enough in each other to want to understand what they're dealing with, what the other person is like, or what they're up to, instead of being shocked by the discovery that somebody doesn't put their toothpaste top back on. They begin to wonder, why the hell do I put mine back on, for God's sake, or something of that kind. They're interested enough in each other. They're interested enough in each other so that these things, which can seem lethal and appalling at times, become, an occasion to advance on their inner grasp of each other. Well, I think I should shut up very soon, and I did want to talk about one other thing, and I mentioned what it was. That is this question of the doctor or the helper and the helped relationship. Because here, too, we have different convictions as to what is healthy and sick or good and bad. For example, how professional should the relationship be between the helper and the helper? And in contrast, how personal should it be? How personal should it be? And I want you to think about that with me for a little while, because I think it's one of the most fundamental divisions within our field. And it's one where we need to be healed, if you like, or brought together, or at least have some conception of how we're going to address that issue. Because you know as well, or better than I do, that this is big-time trouble and stuff. Big time. For example, If you're too professional, and if that means for you being cold or very, very proper or careful in your relationship with the patient, the work can stop. The work can stop. The work can be punished by that because the patient doesn't feel they have an ally, for example. Right? On the other hand, if you are too close, too intimate, the work may explode on your hand. Right? Now, the advantage of being too cold is that you probably won't get in trouble. Right? You probably won't get in trouble. And the lawyers are not making the money they are out of this problem because of that. They're making it because things have gotten out of hand and they've gotten too personal and too close. So now, this talk is an attempt to approach problems of health and sickness in our clinical work. What's health and what's sickness in this matter of the therapeutic relationship? The schools give different answers to this as they have to the other matters that I brought to your attention. The schools give very different answers. I think it's fair to say that a great deal of objective, descriptive, psychopharmacological work is businesslike. Now, I know perfectly well many people who do that who are the best human beings in the world, and they're not just businesslike. So I don't want to tar them with that feather, but with that brush. I mean, I don't. But if you read the textbooks about drug administration, for example, you find that they do sound pretty mechanical. Now, the same charge has been brought against psychoanalysis, that the orthodox analysts were supposed to be a blank screen, withdrawn, not talk at all, perhaps, or only address the negative transference, and they were not supposed to be human beings. So that, too, in the two great orthodoxies, there was a definite diminution of the personal relationship. Now, I don't need to tell you that, that this has been changing due to the influx of existential thought, of the relational people, of many things. Maybe also research. You heard me go on at great length in one of these talks about the very robust evidence that the strongest determinant of outcome is the depth of engagement between the two parties. The strongest determinant of outcome is the depth of engagement between the two parties. That's a very hard that's a very hard claim to question anymore. And that suggests, doesn't it, that a mechanical relationship is not going to do the job, and that we need something more personal. But how personal? How personal? And how do you apportion what your energies are in both those directions? Now I want to close these four sets of remarks by making a suggestion. I believe, or I speculate, that the best clinical recommendation is to be both as professional and as personal as possible. Both as professional and as personal as possible. You remember I quoted a book that Kathy Shen gave me many years ago on the memoirs of Hadrian, in which Hadrian, you remember, claimed that his strength, the great Roman Empire who revived the empire, that his strength was that he dared to be both as free and as compliant as possible. So there was a paradox too, wasn't it? And that was easier to understand. Can I really be free unless I comply with some things? Otherwise, I'm always in revolt. And can I really comply unless I'm free to comply? You know? Well, I would argue that this professional-personal paradox is very much of the same kind. I don't think you can afford to be personal unless you're very professional. And I don't think you can afford to be professional unless you're willing to be very personal. So the two are not in opposition, but they strain against each other. And what it is that makes it possible for a person to be as close to you as anyone will ever be in your life, as some helpers are, as close to you as anybody will ever be in your life, and still give you a feeling of safety and concern without intrusiveness, with respect for your independence. What permits that? What makes that possible? I've quoted to you a piece of a line that I love from Conrad Lorenz, and let me subject you to it again, but it was, remember Conrad Lorenz was the ethologist, the man who studied the ducks, was it, or what, ducks? Some kind of creature, right? Anyway, and the impact of the mother duck on the baby ducks and the substitution of a mother, a human mother, had the ducks following him around, all kinds of things like that. And but he made a statement at one point. I don't know whether it's in his Nobel address. He won the Nobel Prize, I think. But somewhere he says, you heard me say this once or twice before, he said, most people, now most people is that like E. Cummings people, people E. Cummings didn't like, most people, dear old Conrad Lorenz said, are the missing link between apes and human beings. Now, what does that imply? It implies that human beings would not be grasping. I don't know. Maybe apes are human beings. We shouldn't put them down too much. But to be able to be with people, to be close with people without taking advantage of or using them, that might be a feature of human being. And to be challenged by all kinds of seductiveness from the patient, from anyone, and find it as something that they could use in the treatment but not abuse in the treatment. All those things might be part of the definition of human being. And then this vision I have, which I try desperately to realize in my own life, and I'm sure I fail most of the time. This vision I have of marriage, in which it's a kind of voyage, in which one meets the discoveries you make about each other, the awful discoveries you make about each other. Always there is some, right? And if you don't make that about your wife, then you find out about your father-in-law. So it's easy to become discordant in these relationships. But that these things could be an occasion for enlarging your experience, for, I don't know what, I don't like the term forgiveness, but I suppose something like that, but at least for an openness. And I think I wouldn't feel foolish saying this. I would feel foolish saying this if I didn't feel that there was a whole tradition in which this seems to me central. I'm not a good meditator, and but the Buddhist conception of meditation seems to me to speak to this very much. I don't know what you're like when you meditate, but I find that if I try to meditate, very soon I'm concentrating on my abdominal breathing. That's my favorite device. It also helps you go to sleep. And I'm concentrating on my abdominal breathing and trying to keep my thoughts on my abdominal breathing. Not very interesting, but I try to keep my thoughts there. And try as I might, very soon my mind goes off, leaves me. I don't generally hallucinate, at least not yet, but it's like that. It's like that. I've lost my mind. It's something's come in and taken it over. A little dissociative piece has come and taken me over. So that, and I think that's the kind of thing that makes this ideal in marriage tempting, that you could encounter not only in yourself now, these discordant things, but in someone else, and see them as just another human, wandering of one kind or another. Well, thank you for listening so kindly. I got through the fourth one.
Wondering on your observations of marriage, would you say that it's the same thing throughout life?
Stand up, make a speech, come on. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you about how marriage might change throughout life. It seems to me that sex might be very important when one's young.
Yeah?
And
Less important, yeah.
less important
Yeah.
when one's older, or when you get to middle age, the fact that you're not ideal and neither is the other.
Yeah, might be easier to do that, right? But you know, you're forgetting what it's like to have a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. Who was that?
You have to remember it to forget it.
But that old gentleman who died at about 80 or something with I think his sixth or seventh wife, who was about 20 or 25, you know, and he wouldn't like your advice at all. And I think a lot of people wouldn't. That, in fact, I have been impressed by how older men, I've known now that I'm almost 80, my practice gets older and older, partly because the same people come back to me, but also because I think they feel safer with an older person. And I have a few men about my own age who confess to me very cautiously, terribly afraid, I think, of being humiliated, that they wish they didn't have to have sex. Prostatectomy is a occasion to discover this in spades. But even without that, they discover that maybe they feel like they're supposed to have it, that they're not being manly if they don't, that their wife might be unhappy, right? Or look elsewhere. They didn't. So there's a lot of social pressure in this guy, and it's very hard to tell what's really what you want and what the social pressure is. This is also true at the other end of life, in adolescence, where an awful lot of behavior is really an effort to keep up with your friends, or people you think of as your friends. And what do you really want to do? Well, this human being that we're thinking about a little bit is, you know, maybe he doesn't care about that as much as most people, right? Maybe not, but...
What does the word compliant mean?
Wow. Up. Speak. Yell.
Speech. What does the word compliant mean to you? You used it on a few occasions, and I'm not quite sure.
Compliant.
Yeah.
Well, I used it in terms of the Memoirs of Hadrian book, because one of the rules that Hadrian set up for the administration of the provinces, which were often taken over by the so-called primitive groups that had come down from the west and the east, I mean from the north and the east, was that they had to comply with certain things, notably the dictates of the Roman legion. But otherwise they were free to comply with their own customs, with their own practices, religious, other kinds. And that's what it meant, I think.
And you used it in another lecture as well.
Mm-hmm.
You used it in another lecture as well.
Yeah. Well, I think...
Could I ask you one other question?
Please.
You said that if a person is really, really wealthy, then they have a certain outlook about marriage.
Yeah.
What if a person is really, really poor? I think that has a really traumatic effect on marriage.
Very traumatic effect on marriage, right? And it's especially, you tell me what you think. You may know more about this than I do, but one of the effects of poverty on marriage is that the man experiences himself as a failure, and in fact may be thought of as a failure in the family. A terrible thing.
So it does something to the institution or the
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
It's harder than to go to that route of discovery or adventure, perhaps, because you have all of these conflicts and lack of knowledge about where each person is coming as a person.
Right. Don't you think it's true that a very large number of men, and I'm sure to myself to some extent too, regard our justification as the fact we have an income? That whatever you think of us, we brought home the bacon. Right? Yeah? No.
You said that there's a correlation, a robust correlation between a good outcome in therapy and the depth of the relationship.
You speak to them.
And I'm wondering what you mean by depth.
Well, The question was, if I think it's a good bet that there is a strong correlation between the engagement and the outcome. And I think you can read that data. This is less common. By the depth of engagement also corresponds to the completeness of the value of the outcome. What is depth of engagement? Well, I gave a talk. I don't think you were here then, but I gave a talk about what I thought the measurements. So, I mean, very crude. I would love to know something else about it, but you may know much more about it. What would be the measurement? Well, I said that I thought engagement began on a certain acceptance of the other's feelings, an understanding of their situation, an appreciation of their strengths, and a sharing of their future aspirations or creating future aspirations. That those four things, right? And then I went on to say that I thought that a successfully negotiated engagement not only entailed those things, but also entailed the experience of what I called collision. That is, your two people are in the dark about each other. We're all in the dark about each other always, but at the beginning we're very much in the dark, and so we collide. The way you hit somebody when you're in the cellar trying to find somebody. You collide. And how do you handle that collision? How do you handle that collision? I mentioned experience I had many, many years ago where I was meeting a patient for the first time, and in the course of the interview, I said one of those ridiculous remarks I'm sure we all make to the patient. I said, "Tell me about your mother. You know, tell me about your mother. What the hell would I be looking for?" Anyway, and the patient said to me, "I killed her. I killed her." I mean, obviously this person was not fooling. Right? What do you say? Well, you know, it's a show. It's a stopper, right? And it's a collision. What do you say? You know, I don't know what I said. I hope I said something honest like, "Oh my God." You know?
Then you ask about death.
Then you ask about death.
Dad.
Dad.